Today, Wilbur Ross, in testimony before the Senate, seemed to suggest or downplay the whole notion of a security threat as it pertains to Canada, and said the tariffs were more linked to trying to stop the glut of Chinese steel entering markets like Canada to go to the U.S. Have you been given assurances by the U.S. that if you can prove Canada is taking these steps, that they would repeal these 232 tariffs?
We have not. I was glad, I read very briefly just before coming here reports of those remarks from Secretary Ross, and I will look forward to reading in more detail a transcript of that committee appearance. From what I saw, I welcome Secretary Ross's remarks. I was pleased to see, according to reports, that Secretary Ross acknowledged that Canadian steel does not pose a security threat to the United States. We think that is self-evident, and that is what we have been saying from the beginning, and it's very good to hear that from Secretary Ross. I was also pleased to read in the reports of his remarks an acknowledgement from Secretary Ross that the United States does have a surplus in trade in steel with Canada. That's another point that we've been making, and it was great to hear it from him. And Secretary Ross is someone with whom I have a good relationship. We've spoken about Section 232, so good to hear all of those comments from him. On your safeguard question, Canada has put in place well in advance of the Section 232 decision by the United States, strengthened extensive safeguard measures. And I'd like to point out, we have our own national interest to avoid dumping of steel and aluminum in the Canadian market. So we put in place these safeguard measures, of course, to be good partners for our trading partners, but first and foremost, to protect our industries and our workers against unfair actions by others. I have very great confidence in the Canadian safeguard regime, which has been considerably strengthened by our government. And we have discussed at some length on many occasions, we have discussed and explained the Canadian safeguard measures to our American partners. And I would be happy at any time to continue that discussion and to explain the strength of the measures that we have in place. They're strong, they need to be. And one other point I think that's worth making on the safeguard issue is this is not a one-off issue. What you need to do in a situation like the one we have today, where there is an overcapacity in products like steel, is you need to be constantly on the alert. You need to be aware of new areas where subsidized products are coming in. And so it's an ongoing discussion, it's an ongoing process, and it's something that Canada is very actively engaged in collaboration with our industry.
These policies without considering what happens to them, I think is a huge mistake. I'd like to ask you, following on to the Chairman's questions of you, Mr. Secretary, what is it about the Canadian steel industry that is a national security interest to the threat to the United States?
Oh, the Canadian steel industry is not being accused of directly and individually being a security threat.
What is our trade deficit in steel with Canada?
We don't have a trade deficit of note.
We don't?
No, sir.
Do we have a surplus with Canada in
Yes,
steel?
sir. We have a surplus in dollars.
So does that surplus...
May I finish my answer?
Sure, of course.
We have a surplus in dollars. We do not have a surplus in physical volume.
Okay,
What happens is steel...
Mr. Secretary, what is the national security threat of the trade surplus that the United States has with Canada in steel?
The national security implication is in the aggregate all of the steel.
But why would you put a tariff on, what is the national security basis for the tariff that you have placed on Canada? I understand what we're supposed to be doing with China. I don't understand why the president's not focused on it. I don't understand why he's excluding ZTE. I don't understand it. What is the national security rationale for putting a tariff on the Canadian steel industry with whom we have a trade surplus?
Yeah, if you would let me finish the answer,
I will.
I'll try to do so. The reason the tariff is being put on essentially all countries, most of whom are friendly countries and have good relations with us, and some others of which also have surpluses with us. The reason it has to be a global solution is if you just looked at the raw data, you wouldn't think China is a problem for the U.S. because what they've been doing is masking their exports to us by shipping them through other countries. So the raw data, if you just believe the raw numbers, China is shipping less to us than they did 5 years ago. The reality is quite to the contrary. They are disrupting the global steel markets. They are causing both direct and indirect damage to it. So we have to do it on a global basis. I'm not quite finished.
I'm sorry.
The good news is that as a direct result of the 232s, suddenly Europe is enacting safeguards against steel dumping into Europe. They didn't do much before. Canada is taking action. Japan, for the first time, has created an enforcement body within METI to deal with the problem. The only way we're going to solve the global steel overproduction and overcapacity is by getting all the other countries to play ball with us. And while they're complaining bitterly about the tariffs, the fact is they're starting to take the kind of action which, if they had taken sooner, would have prevented this crisis.
Senator, your time is up. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming today. I know you expect me to focus on tariffs as ably described by my colleague from Colorado, and putting agriculture commodities in